Welcome, Irish fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. I'm the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com. My nombre is Vince DeDario, and my compadre is Bryan Driskell. He is the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. And we're going to kind of start a little bit of a series here talking about season wrap-ups, let's call it. We're going to talk – today we're going to do one on the defensive side of the ball, and our next podcast we will talk about the offensive side of the ball, just basically our season, review, what we thought. We're going to break it down. Where did they stand, against other teams in the country, other elite squads? How does that shape up with other Notre Dame teams that we've seen in recent years? And then where are they headed as a whole? What direction are they headed in? Do they have a bunch of starters that they're going to have to replace? Are there a bunch of holes to fill? And we kind of know the answer to that, but we want to make sure that we start the offseason with a nice bow on the 2020 season, if you will. So we're gonna jump into the defense today, Bryan, and let's start with the big picture. Your thoughts on the defense as a whole? I think we can both agree that the defense was a strength of this team overall. But let's jump into some specifics. What were your thoughts on the defense as a whole this season?
I mean, they carried the team for much of the year.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really dive into the numbers, for all the talk, sometimes narratives get created around Notre Dame, and I don't know where they came from. And I just remember thinking the first half of the year, people talking about the job that the offense did and Tommy Rees did, and I have no clue where that came from. And I'm thinking to myself, you scored 27 points against Duke. You scored 12 points against Louisville. You look at the 45 points against Pitt. One of those touchdowns is a special teams touchdowns, and 3 of your touchdowns came on short fields. The offense really had 2 big plays, and that was about it. And I'm just hearing this narrative, and I'm thinking, this is a defensive team, and part of it is because of Brian Kelly. Brian Kelly liked to talk about the offense a lot, and Tommy Rees and all that job. And we've seemed to hear more about the defense when they didn't have a big game. And so whatever the case may be, that was my perception. But the defense carried this team. And I'll be honest with you, Vince, the defense was better than I thought it was going to be this year. I actually thought the defense was going to take a bigger step back statistically than it did. Number one, I thought they played better offenses than they have in recent seasons. That became especially true when you add Alabama into the mix at the end. Notre Dame has benefited in recent seasons. They've had great defenses in past seasons, but they haven't played a lot of great offenses. The power team that they played in 2019, Georgia, it was a really good team, but Georgia's not exactly an explosive offensive football team. They're more like Notre Dame than they are the premier programs like Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State.
Sure.
So, and I thought they did a great job in those games. They had a couple clinkers last year, but they bounced back strong. You're always going to have games like that. The Michigan game obviously was really bad, but then the rest of the year they were dominant on defense. Carry that over into 2020. Despite losing Julian Aguara, despite losing Khalid Kareem, despite losing Troy Pride, despite losing, Alohi Gilman, Jalen Elliott. I mean, they lost some really good football players the last 2 years. The year before that, they lost Drew Tranquill, Tavon Coney, Jerry Tillery, Julian Love.
A lot of turnover,
So that defense has lost a lot of players. And honestly, I don't think the high-end – I think the high-end talent on this defense was as good as we've seen since probably 2015. When you look at Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, who's going to be a first-round pick.
Sure.
When you look at Kyle Hamilton, who's an All-American. I think Dalen Hayes was one of the most underrated defensive linemen in the country. And that's because he's not a sack guy. But that's not what he's necessarily asked to do. He was second on the team in quarterback pressures despite having almost 100 fewer pass rush attempts than did Adi Ogundiji this past season. So I thought it was a very strong group. And I think it was better as a unit than it necessarily was 11 great players.
Agreed.
The defensive tackle position comes to mind. I don't know if there was a standout at defensive tackle the way that Jerry Tillery was in 2018.
Right.
The other linebackers, other than Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, were good players, but not, future third-round draft picks, fourth-round draft picks like Drew Tranquill was. Cornerback was way, way below what it had been in previous years with Troy Pride and Julian Love. And it's just kind of funny. I want to be like, all those people that were hard on Julian Love or Troy Pride in 2019, and I'll never understand that.
Right.
Probably would have loved to have had him back this year.
I was going to say.
Yeah. And it's just kind of funny how, again, it's those narratives that created, because as a corner, he would not give up any throws, but then he'd give up like a back shoulder every now and then. But that's all they'd see him. And so the only time fans saw Troy Pride was when he's giving up catches. Well, that's because the TV angle. And the reason you don't see it often is because the
They're not
dude
going that
down.
way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just funny how those narratives get created sometimes. But there's so many things we could point to, is like the Buck linebacker position. Your starting Buck linebacker this year had 14 tackles.
Right.
And you still had a top 20 defense, so there just was so many things you look at and say, there's no reason this team should have been as good as it was on defense, and yet they were.
Yeah.
And I think a great deal of credit obviously goes to Clark Lee, who I thought did a very good job this year, outside of my still shaking my head trying to fathom why he kept throwing Shane Simon out there every week. Mike Elston, I think, deserves a ton of credit for the job he did developing that defensive line. I mean, they were throwing waves at people. And then I think Mike Mickens did a really good job when you consider the talent level they had at corner this year. The fact Tariq Bracy just kind of went into the tank. He was supposed to be a big part of what this team was going to be. I thought he played well early in the year, and then he lost his confidence. And you're throwing in, Clarence Lewis, and you're still able to go out there and win football games. I think he deserves a ton of credit for that. And so overall, I think it was better than I expected it to be. It carried the team for a big chunk of the year, but we saw it down the stretch against Clemson in the ACC title game. We saw against Alabama in the playoff that it's still a unit, that there are some spots where the talent level isn't as good as it was in past seasons. The talent level isn't as good as it needs to be at a couple spots to really be on that championship level, but it's so strong at other positions that they're able to make up for it. Because you look at Alabama, I mean, we talked going into that game, there's some dudes on that defense that can be taken advantage of, right? So we talked about Clemson. The secondary the safety position was not a strength. So everybody has these weaknesses. It's just we're going to focus on Notre Dame's. So sure. I don't think there's not a defense that I saw that was strong at 11 spots.
Right.
So Notre Dame is not unique. So you look at what they did in big games. Even though they gave up a lot of points to Clemson and Alabama, they played, I think the example I point to is the tougher schedule is you played Clemson twice, you played Alabama, you played North Carolina.
Right.
North Carolina's one hung 27 on a Texas A&M defense that was supposed to be pretty good this year, and they did it with other than Sam Howell, their top 5 offensive weapons. 2,000-yard rushers were out. Right. 1,000-yard receiver was out, and they still went and hung 27 up on an SEC defense and had the lead in the fourth quarter.
Who was supposedly supposed to get into the playoff over Notre Dame.
Right. Notre Dame held a healthy North Carolina team in their own stadium to 17 points and less than 300 yards of offense.
With all of the guys that you just mentioned that did not play in the bowl game.
Correct. Yes. So you have kudos to them. I mean, I thought they did a great job with the Boston College offense, which was an offense that had some strong moments. So
sure.
I think overall, Vince, I don't know if you had the same expectation for this defense coming into the year. I don't know if you thought they were going to be phenomenal. I just didn't. And so the fact that they're statistically overall about where they've been the last 2 years, I thought was an impressive thing to see.
From a personal standpoint, what I thought that they were going to be, from a Notre Dame standpoint, I did think that they were going to be the strength of the team. I thought the defense was still going to be the strength of this team. I wasn't sure where they were going to rank along with everybody else, but I did think that they were going to be a strength of the team. I thought they were going to be better than the offense, and that did end up happening. I didn't know what the degree of difference was going to be, obviously, but that part was expected to me. But I do think that they overachieved, and I do think one of the things that surprises me is how well they were able to overcome the Buck linebacker position. Mm-hmm. To be honest with you, that it seems like every game
in all but 2 games.
And the one being Clemson. What was the other one?
The first
South
Clemson Florida
game. Okay,
South Florida.
When
the 2 guys who played all year didn't play.
When it wasn't Shane Simon, yeah.
Or Maris Luafau. I mean, it was Jack Kaiser and Jack Lamb.
Correct. And it was a dominant performance in that particular game. Game balls were given to that position.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually surprised at how they were able to overcome the weakness of that position overall throughout the year. So, and we'll talk about the weaknesses of the defense. And I want to get into the strengths of the defense first. We'll start positive. We'll start with glass half full first, because I'm just a cheery fella. And I didn't know if you were aware of that, but I wanted to remind you of that fact. But before we do, we want to hear from one of our sponsors.
So are you telling me that you're the positive one?
That's what I'm telling you. That's what I'm telling you. Yep.
Interesting take. Interesting take.
You have to be positive.
Somebody was asking if we ever disagree. I'm going to have to disagree with you on this one. So, hey, there you go. There you go.
Disagree. Yeah, absolutely. I have no choice but to be positive teaching during a pandemic.
True.
So that's where I'm going to go. But anyway, Brian, I want to jump into the strengths of this football team because on the defensive side, there were a lot. And so let's be glass half full. Let's put our happy hat on and let's talk about the strengths of this defense. Let's start up front. What were your strengths up front, or were there any?
Yeah, I think the strengths were, I think the two ends that they had were brilliant against the run. I think a big reason that Notre Dame was so good against the run this year is because of Adi Ogundeji and Dalen Hayes being excellent run defenders. That's not a sexy position in the run game for Notre Dame, because they're not necessarily designed to fly off the edge and make a bunch of tackles. They're designed to blow up the edge and set and force either a spill, which is a bounce outside, or force back inside, to where the help is. And that's what they were great at. I think that Dalen Hayes especially was really good against the run this year, not only on runs at him, but also on pursuit away. The fact is teams just really had a hard time getting their run game going. And even Alabama, they ran for, I think Najee Harris had 120 some yards. 53 of those yards came on one play where the defensive line blew the Alabama line off the ball. You had linebackers that didn't scrape over top, and you had a cornerback that whiffed like 5 yards downfield. So even then, Alabama wasn't running the ball on Notre Dame because their defensive line was getting pushed around. It was a snap here, snap there against the best offensive line in the country, but they more than held their own against Alabama. And they really did that all year. I think the only bad game that I thought they had was in the ACC title game. But again, I think Clemson did some things to try to go after them. I think the fact that Alabama was unwilling to try to throw the ball downfield at all against Notre Dame, when clearly they didn't respect the Notre Dame secondary outside of Kyle Hamilton, says everything you know about how they viewed the Notre Dame pass rush.
I agree. I made that point on the radio show earlier this week, was that, look, every pass, was it one pass beyond 20 yards that they attempted and almost got picked off by Kyle Hamilton. So part of it was Kyle Hamilton.
Technically, I just want to be clear, because I've also said the one. Technically, the second touchdown pass, to Jaleel Billingsley, the 12-yard touchdown pass, was technically about 20 yards down the field.
Well, because it was in the end zone.
Because it was in the – but that's not the same thing.
Right.
That's not a typical 20-yard pass, so I don't really count that as a 20-yard pass.
No, I got you.
In the field, there was only one. So technically what I've said is not accurate, but I just want to explain what I mean by that.
The game plan by Alabama was very clear. Quick passes, get it out of the hands of Mac Jones, get it in the hands of the playmakers, Devontae Smith being clearly one of them. But it was a lot of quick slants. It was hitches. It was screens, bubble screens. It was, things of that nature. Mac Jones wasn't holding on to the ball.
No.
And when you have a game plan like that, that's because something about the defense scares you. You don't want to have to deal with taking a 5-step drop or, holding onto the ball for X amount of time. He didn't hold the ball for more than 2.5 seconds, 3 seconds, the vast majority of the game. So there's a reason for that.
I've seen people – I've actually heard there's been a couple conversations I've had with friends of mine. I've had people call me and say, hey, what did you think of this? I heard on some radio show or some podcast or something that Notre Dame, pass defensive line didn't play well and that they got no pressure on the quarterback. I didn't see that. I thought they did get good pressure on the quarterback just the few times that they actually did it.
Right.
And the reality is, when you're playing a team that's just throwing quick game all day, you're not going to have a lot of pressures. I thought the few times that
Exactly.
Alabama did drop back, Notre Dame got good pressure on them. And to put into perspective, in the 11 games before Notre Dame, Alabama threw over 50 shots of at least 20 yards down the field. That's about 5 a game. They did 1 against Notre Dame. So clearly, like you said, Vince, they saw something, and to me, that's kind of how you can evaluate an opponent. To me, or a quality of a part of your team is how do your best opponents, how do they view it, how do they attack it? And the fact is they didn't respect the Notre Dame secondary. They didn't necessarily respect the Notre Dame linebackers, other than Jeremiah Wusu, who they tried to avoid like the plague. And the one time they didn't avoid him and Kyle Hamilton, forced a 6-yard loss.
For a 6-yard loss.
The Heisman Trophy winner, but they respected the defensive line. They were not going to let the Notre Dame defensive line impact that game. And I think that's a great sign of respect for what the Notre Dame defensive line was. Clemson, I thought, did similar things, because Clemson learned in the first matchup, if you make this a line versus line game, you're going to get dominated. North Carolina thought they were good enough to just do what they do against Notre Dame, and they were wrong. And a big part of it was because of how dominant the defensive line was. So even though there was no like all-American caliber player like there was at linebacker in the secondary, the defensive line, to me, Vince, was the most complete unit on the defense.
Completely agree.
They were good. I thought Kurt Heinisch had a really good, steady year. He's not a great producer. He's not going to have a ton of sacks but he's just a hustle guy. I thought,
and he flashed during the first Clemson game. I thought it was clear to even people that don't watch football in a way that you and I watch football. The way he was getting a push up the middle was also one of the reasons that Travis Etienne did not have a very good run day.
Yeah, and there was no cutback lanes. And I thought the Notre Dame staff did a really good job of limiting his reps this year, keeping a fresh rotation going. I think the depth at defensive tackle allowed him to really keep that motor running hot all the time, which made him a better player. I think the depth at defensive line was great. Isaiah Foskey showed great potential. Ovia Gofu had some flashes of good play. Justin Adamiola, as a rotation guy, was an outstanding run defender. It didn't matter who Notre Dame had in the game at strong side end. You weren't running on the strong side ends, whether it was Ogundeji or Justin Adamiola. They were great at it. And Riley Mills came in and got better this year. It's amazing what happens when you actually play a freshman, which like they do on defense, and that guy just keeps getting better. I'm sorry, I got to stop being so snarky about that, but it is true. It is true. And the depth really showed, because you had games where you were missing guys,
Myron Tagovailoa.
Right.
He was
missed
out.
some games. Justin Adamiola missed a couple games.
Right.
Jason Adamiola missed some games down the stretch. He was a really good pass rusher this year. I thought he was excellent against Alabama when he got his opportunity to get after the quarterback. And
just to belabor the point that you were making, putting Riley Mills in earlier into some high leverage situations allowed for when those other guys were out to count on a guy like that, as opposed to putting him in, fresh and not having any experience. He's better off for that.
Yeah, and Jacob Lacey was banged up all year. He missed, I think, a couple games. He was banged up all year. But they were so deep. Howard Cross came in. I still don't know how that kid holds up. I don't. I don't know how he's able to play, because he's so small. But he fights, he competes, he's quick. They use his athleticism. They don't ask him to anchor a lot. And that's one thing I like about Clark Lee is he's not going to ask Howard Cross, who's maybe 275 pounds. I'm sorry. I'll believe that when I see it. You know what I mean? They're not going to ask him to play the way Kurt Heinisch does. They were playing Howard Cross at times this year nose. That's how thin that's how the depth got at some point in time. And he held his own, because they allowed him to play to his strengths.
Absolutely.
As opposed to, hey, we're going to ask you to just do what we do. And so that's, to me, what made the defensive line so good. And to me, that was the best unit on the team. When they didn't have great games, the defense didn't have a great game. Florida State is an example. And I also thought they were clutch. Dalen Hayes with the big plays against Georgia Tech. Adi Ogundeji with that big third down stop against North Carolina. When a play needed to get made, they a lot of times they made it. And to me, that's what made it. Fourth overtime against Clemson.
Yeah, huge.
The back-to-back sacks from Ogundeji and Hayes. And so really just hats off to the defensive line this year. Because, again, there's no first-round pick there. Maybe Isaiah Foskey in a couple of years, but he wasn't a first-round pick in 2020. He's still a young guy that's tremendously talented that's still learning how to play the game.
Sure.
So, it was really fun to watch that group play because they epitomize team football.
Yeah.
On the defense as a whole, they epitomize team football, but I think that's especially true up front. There was a lot of discipline amongst that group. And the few times they got out of play, gave up some big plays. But it rarely happened because they were just so good, so disciplined, so athletic. And kudos to Clark Lee for allowing them to play. They didn't play the defensive line this year like they did in 2018. They didn't because they didn't have the size. They adjusted. And they said, we're athletic, we're quick, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to let Kurt Hinish shoot gaps more. I thought they did that more this year, and it was more effective.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was impressed with the defensive line. It was the strength of the team, if that makes sense. And I'm a little worried about some of the depth and some of the positions moving forward, but that, my friend, is a different podcast, and we will come back to that at another time. Yeah. But let's start moving our way backwards. So let's talk instead of just taking the linebackers and then the secondary. Let's talk about the back seven.
Yeah. That's smart because I think they play because of the way Notre Dame plays defense. Yes. They're almost, especially the safeties,
right?
They're so intertwined in their responsibilities and how they play. Yeah,
right.
Let's do that.
So a lot of times you hear about the front seven. We're going to talk about the back seven, and I think the back seven there were some holes, but I thought that through coaching, I think they covered up some of those holes pretty well the vast majority of the season,
as best they could.
Yes, as best they could, and let's be honest, I'm trying not to be negative, but one of those holes was because of coaching.
Sure.
That's a different,
Well, we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that in the negatives. Yeah. So we're staying positive right now. Or we can talk about the front side or the back seven.
Let's So like for me, the biggest thing different this year, Vince, was they had stars. And those stars played like stars consistently.
Yes.
And that's obviously Jeremiah Wusu at Rover and Kyle Hamilton at safety.
It's great to have that at two levels. So we talked about having a star at each level and how important that is to a good defense, and those two were absolutely stars at those two levels.
To even a more specific point, there's different types of stars. You can have a big thumper, a Manti Te'o kind of star player. There's different types of ways to dominate. I think the fact that Owusu, Koromoa, and Hamilton are the way that they are played a big role in this. And what I mean by that is they're erasers. And you talk about covering up mistakes. There were times this year that Kyle Hamilton and Jeremiah Wusu made plays where, as a football coach, I'm watching it, you're watching, you're saying, if he doesn't make that play, ... But they always made the play. You know what I mean?
Right.
Almost always. There were some mistakes here and there, especially from a tackling standpoint with Jeremiah Wusu, angle standpoint with Kyle Hamilton. But overall, they were just excellent. They could erase mistakes. I mean, part of the reason Notre Dame was so effective with RPOs and still able to play a good run defense was, Kyle Hamilton could stay back at 12 yards, and once he decides that it's a run play, he can be downhill in so fast.
He erases those 12 yards so
in a hurry,
incredibly fast. Yeah.
And then closes with force. Jeremiah Wusu is the same way. Thinking, boy, we got this guy out leveraged. Let's run this quick screenplay, and then bam, he just outruns everyone to the ball.
Luck.
And that's that. You just elite athleticism, elite playmakers. There's not a team in the country that wouldn't have just done whatever possible to get those two kids on their defense this year.
No doubt.
So I think that was a big reason. Coaching was a part of it. And I've talked to some friends of mine that coach in the ACC, and the one thing they'll say is, boy, Clark does a great job of masking his weaknesses. And one of the things that I heard from talking to my friends was they completely changed how they use their corners this year compared to the previous 2 years, which is good coaching because they didn't have Julian Love and Troy Pride anymore.
Right.
And so they couldn't just line up and go man the way that they did with Troy Pride so much last year. And the way, and Nick McLeod's a good player, but he's not Julian Love.
And so they sit in zone the way Julian Love, or the way he did things.
Yeah. Right. And so they did a really good job of masking those players and then playing to the strengths of their team, which is the linebacker athleticism and then Kyle Hamilton. So really good job there. And they did it as much as they could. When you play teams like Alabama and Clemson, you can't hide those guys. The truth will come out. I remember Mike Elko, I think his first year, he called what was his nickname for Quentin Nelson and Mike McGlinchey, right? Like they were like truth serum or something like that. Like,
Yeah,
you know, you weren't going to hide when you were going against those guys. You're going to find out really who you were. You know, and that's kind of how some of those teams are offensively. And we saw the personnel holes in the defense, but they were able to do such a good job, those two guys, of erasing those mistakes, that it gave Mike Elko or Clark Lee a lot of freedom to do certain things, knowing he had those two erasers. We saw him use them more on blitzes this year. I think we saw more pressures from the linebacker safety level than we had seen in past years. Not that they didn't use safeties. I mean, I think it was Virginia that Alohi Gilman had a big sack last year. I think it was Virginia, might not have been, but you know, so we've seen them use safety pressures before, but this year it was constant. You know, he would bring Kyle Hamilton down in the box and then drop him, which you can't do with a guy with less range. So he used his strengths of his players and did it really well. And I think that those two were big reasons why they were so effective this year. And and I think Clarence Lewis was a pleasant surprise in the second.
Yeah.
Cloud was a good football player. Didn't really play a ton of boundary receivers that could scare you, but did what he was supposed to do in those situations. I thought Clarence Lewis did what he was asked to do and did it well. You know, and then when they went against top level players, he, you know, had some struggles. But you just like his competitiveness, and it was able to overcome the fact that one of the negatives was the fact that Tariq Bracy just completely lost his confidence this year.
And that's a shame because we've seen him at his best.
Yeah.
You know, when they played
we
Georgia.
saw it at times this year. I mean, this year he had a couple good games early, and then he just and that, to me, that's not coaching. I mean, the corner's either got to have it or, you know, he doesn't. And we've seen Tariq go through these ups and downs before, and you know, he's going to have to figure something out because he's a very talented athlete, very talented cover player when he's locked in.
He comes back. I mean, he's not leaving.
Right.
So he's going to be in the mix next year. So that's something that they're going to have to get figured out, because if Tariq Bracy can flip the switch and just be consistent, you know, I like the combination of Tariq Bracy and Clarence Lewis, you know, coming back, because they got
the boundary. Yeah,
you got a ton of experience. Yeah, you got a ton of experience coming back with those two, and then you've got some pretty talented guys sitting there in the 2 deep to battle them. So I think that potential negative from this year could be turned into a positive if the right steps are taken.
Right. So I think that the athleticism of this group shined for most of the year. Again, Alabama was able to expose the two positions where I think they lacked athleticism, and that was corner and the strong safety position, the field safety position. Alabama took advantage of that. Clemson took advantage of that. But I think against most teams, the athleticism they had really shined, and especially at linebacker. I think one of the most underappreciated players for Notre Dame is Drew White, and him and Dalen Hayes, to me, are the two most underappreciated players. I think Dalen Hayes was brilliant this year. I really do. And I don't think he got the love because he didn't put up the sack numbers you expect a 5-star to put up. That's not really what they asked that drop player to do. They did that with Julian Akwara because that's all Julian Akwara was really good at.
That's what he's really good at. He struggled when he had to actually drop into coverage.
Right.
Yeah.
He had that pick against Michigan, but that was kind of like he was at the right place at the right time, you know?
Right, sure.
The guy kind of just – Shea Patterson didn't see him, and he picked it. But he wasn't a guy you were going to ask to play in coverage a whole lot. And then Drew White's the other one. And I think the big misnomer is I've heard a lot of people in conversations have compared him to Joe Schmidt. And I'm like, the only thing they have in common is they're about the same height and they're white. I mean, that's the only thing Drew White and Joe Schmidt have in common. Drew White is a very good athlete. And I don't think people appreciate how good he is as an athlete. Now, he's not very good in coverage, but I think that's more about a length thing.
Sure.
And the fact he's a little over aggressive.
Yeah.
Right. But Clark Lee doesn't use him playing coverage a whole lot. And then one of his biggest moments of the year was a coverage play.
Where he tipped the ball and it got intercepted.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Showed run, but then kind of smoked run and then dropped underneath that post route, got his hands on the ball. Kyle Hamilton picked it off, you know. So but they masked his they used his aggressiveness as a positive instead of putting him in situations where he got
that's coaching
beat.
Yeah,
and it hurt them at times. I mean, some teams were able to expose it at times. That's how Bama got that touchdown over the top, is they took advantage of the fact that none of the linebackers were really great at coverage.
Yeah,
and so they got behind that, but he was really good downhill. He was an aggressive player, shot gaps, plays a lot of range. And when he was on his game, He was very productive. I do think the knock on Drew White for me this year is he was a little up and down early in the year.
Agreed.
It was some good games, and then some you're like, what is he doing? And I think for him, it was getting used to playing in a rotation, which he didn't really do the year before.
Because he was more in a rotation with Bro Bauer this year than he was last year.
Correct.
Which I think was the right move, by the way.
Agree.
Because I think Bo Bauer took a step from last year to this year where he earned his playing time.
And I think it helped keep Drew fresh all year.
Sure,
because Drew White is not a big guy. And because you have to use him as a box player, there's a greater where he's not built like Manti Te'o.
Sure.
And so I think it was a smart move. So I'm not I wish Clark Lee would have, done that in the past more often. I think we could have seen more of that in the past years, but it is what it is. That's without having us seen practice. That's just kind of my opinion based on their talent. I'm sure there was practice reasons why he saw what he saw. But I think those were some of the things that I really liked about this group, Vince, and there's a lot of potential there that's got to get tapped into that hurt them at times this year, especially, like I said, at Buck linebacker. But I really liked how well this team ran. I liked how they competed. They were mostly assignment sound. And when you beat them, you had better players. And that's about the only time that Notre Dame really got beat. I thought their tackling was the one thing on the back seven that I'm most critical of consistently.
Right.
We saw it against Clemson. We saw it all year. And it was either one of two things, either either taking a bad angle or over pursuing and missing, over pursuing, not in the traditional sense. That might not be the correct phrase, Vince. I don't mean over pursuing like you went too high and the guy cut inside of you. I mean, you went in there out of control.
Yeah.
Not prepared to wrap up. And I thought we saw way too much of that on the second level and the third level this year.
Well, and I will say in the
hits instead of wrapping up.
I'll say in the Alabama game, it was almost the opposite of that. I thought there was a lot of tentative tackling.
There was that. But that was angles. But then there was the Nick McLeod play that was exactly that. It was him going for a big hit instead of wrapping up, which allowed him to get leaped over.
Right.
If you're going for a hit instead of throwing your shoulder into a guy, you at least knock him out of bounds or flip him in the air.
Right.
You don't get leaped and then he picks up and runs for 53 yards. So, there was some tentativeness in the Alabama game. Agree completely. Over the course of the entire year, I didn't see tentativeness.
Right.
All guys out of control. Guys going for big hits instead of wrapping up and tackling. And I think that was one issue that I saw.
No, I agree with that. And we've, if we're talking about negative, we're kind of mixing the positives and the negatives as our conversation rolls in case everybody's curious as to what the heck we're talking about here. But, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the Buck linebacker position. And again, look, we're not trying to bang on Shane Simon that's not the point.
But it's not personal. We're just talking about his game. It's not personal.
His game. And look, we'll give credit where credit's due. He had one of the best games I've ever seen at a Buck linebacker in the Clemson game the first time around. For him, he had a great game. Overall, though, only managing 14 tackles in a 12-game season where you missed one game. So an 11-game season, that's just not good enough. That's
almost
just
300 snaps.
Right. I'm sorry.
I can't fathom that. I can't fathom.
You can almost accidentally tackle somebody 14 times in that many snaps.
I remember when we talked about how frustrated I was in 2015 when Joe Schmidt went through an entire game against Clemson and didn't record a single tackle. And now you're looking at a Buck linebacker that averaged a little over one tackle per game.
Right.
And so like early in the year, I was kind of willing to give Clark Lee the benefit of the doubt because, number one, a guy like Shane Simon is always going to be attractive to a coach because he's long and he's
athletic, he's fast. I get it.
Right. So you watched him be really robotic early, no instincts whatsoever, late responding to everything, just no sense of read and go, just fly to the ball. And then with Marist, you kind of see almost the opposite with him. You see a guy that flies to the ball, but it's often not the right angle or right gap or whatever. And it's like you couldn't combine them into one guy, unfortunately. But after a while, you kind of say, well, maybe he's just really good in practice. And that's fair. But like after a while, you're kind of like, okay, we've seen enough in games to realize that what he's doing in practice shouldn't matter anymore. This is a liability. And it was a liability far too often. And if it wasn't for – I'm going to tell you something right now. If it wasn't for having Kyle Hamilton on the back end of the defense and having a great defensive line, that position would have got exposed a lot more than it had. And that was my problem area. So it'd be one thing if they didn't have anybody else, but I don't know how you kind of watch the South Florida game and you watch how well Jack Lamb played in nickel last year and say that Jack Kaiser and Jack Lamb don't deserve more snaps.
Sure, absolutely.
And that just blew my mind. And so it's
I
one of the great mysteries, Vince. I still can't think of a justification for why we kept seeing the same duo week after week after week.
Couple years down the road when we get far away, you need to give Clark Lee a call and be like, "Hey, man, I gotta ask you a question." Just, you just
took Vandy to a bowl game. What the heck were you thinking?
Right. I wanted to give a little perspective here. Remember last year at the beginning of the year, you and I and many others were at a loss for why Asmar Bilal was starting, and we didn't think anything was gonna, it was a disaster. It was gonna be a disaster.
I said flatly, you can't have a great defense with Asmar Bilal linebacker. I'll say it. I said that.
Right.
I said that early in the year,
and we were wrong.
After the Louisville game, I thought I was. See, that's what I'm talking about right there.
Right.
Bam.
And he ended up playing very well.
Way wrong.
We were way wrong, and we made
by the
both
third
of that
game
one.
of the year.
Yes, absolutely.
He showed that we were wrong.
Absolutely. But just as a comparison, he played the same position, 79 tackles last year.
Yeah,
79.
He had almost as many tackles for loss as Shane Simon had tackles.
Stop it.
He did. He had 10 tackles for loss last year.
I know.
He had more tackles. He had actually, and I'm going to say this. He had more tackles. He had twice as many tackles for loss, 10, as Shane Simon had solo tackles, 5.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it.
Right.
No, 9 solo tackles. He had 5 assists. So he had more tackles for loss than Shane Simon had solo tackles.
Correct.
That's just
and
I have no word except unfathomable. I can't.
The year before, here's some fun for you. The year before, Drew Tranquil was in the puck position, right? 86 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks. Okay, 86 tackles, and I'm not saying Drew. I'm not saying Shane Simon is Drew Tranquil. We know what Drew Tranquil is. Whatever.
It wasn't even a third of Drew Tranquil, a quarter of Drew Tranquil from a production standpoint.
The point is, it is such a difference in compare. It's the same position. It's the same defense, and there's such a difference in stat production.
Well, and if you add him and Merritt, because part of it was he rotated a lot more.
Okay,
so let's be fair, right? He played a lot fewer snaps. I don't have time to look the numbers up now, but I'm actually I'll try as we're talking. But his numbers, he had 297 snaps last year, right? So that's one thing. So let's kind of look at it that, right? I would imagine Drew Tranquil was in the 5s. I would imagine. Okay. Right. But when you add all the Bucks, the 3 Bucks really that played this year, when you look at Jack Kaiser, Marist, and Shane Simon,
and Kaiser played what?
A couple. He played a few
games.
Yeah,
but
he got in against BC, for example, had an interception against BC.
Played the whole South Florida game,
right?
Or the most of the South Florida
Well, him and
game.
Jack Lamb played the South Florida game together, and they combined to play really well. Jack Lamb was actually Pro Football Focus's highest graded defensive player in that game.
Amazing.
So, so there were some things that you saw, but you add those 3 guys together, they had 56 tackles this year. It's still not anywhere close to what it was before, and only 1 fewer game. You know, because it was a shortened season for a lot of people. Notre Dame only had it shortened by 1 game compared to other years, which is a huge credit to the Notre Dame program as a whole.
No doubt.
That they only lost the 1 game. And really, they only lost that game. They lost the game first time because of the issues they had, which everyone's going to have some sort of COVID issue. But they could have played it the second time. They were prepared to play it the second time. So Vince, I am having such a hard time understanding just how you kept seeing that week after week after week. So comparison, by the way, Asmar had 684 tackles last year. So about over twice the amount of tackle.
684 plays.
Yeah, that'd be a heck of a year.
I was going to say, wow.
That's old school BC stat production right there. Luke Kuechly sniffs a pile. Assist. But 684 snaps, 336 run snaps. So Shane Simon, this is according to Pro Football Focus. Shane Simon this year, I got to scroll down because he's way down here. He had 297 total snaps, 138 rush snaps. So about a third of the total rush snaps.
Okay.
But the level of production compared to, so even if you took his 14 tackles and timed it by 3, that's 42.
Yeah.
That's nowhere close
to
the level of production.
79.
Right.
79. Yeah, right.
Correct.
Right.
And so it just, there's no justification for it. I don't think did he have any tackles for loss this year? Simon?
I already got rid of the sheet. I apologize.
Had one tackle for loss.
I think it was in the Clemson game, actually.
One tackle for loss for -1 yard. I just don't know how that's possible at your Buck linebacker position.
Right. So room to improve at the Buck linebacker position. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, Maris had 1.5 tackles for loss. So your two primary Bucks had 2.5 tackles for loss the entire year.
Yeah. It's a problem. I mean, honestly, that's a problem. Now, is there anything else that you wanted to bring up as far as, positives, negatives, before we move on to our next little mini topic here before we close up?
The hard part, Vince, for me is being critical of Sean Crawford, because I have such great respect for Sean Crawford as a man. He's not even a young man. I mean, he's a man.
He's a man. He's got his doctorate.
I mean that with a great deal of respect. But the fact of the matter is he was a liability many times this year. And the frustration for me is people came around to it late in the year and everybody kept focusing on the great story. But Vince, you and I talked about Sean Crawford a lot this year, and people didn't want to hear it sometimes, but he was a liability for a lot of the year. The problem was there weren't teams that were good enough up front to allow the quarterbacks the time to beat him.
To take advantage of that.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
And they didn't always face the type of offenses that could expose that. But there were a lot of missed tackles. There were poor angles. I mean, there were times he would just flat out whiff in space. And part of it was he was learning a new position where he was having to play. I mean, he had always been close to the line of scrimmage. He was either a nickel where he's up close to the line of scrimmage, or he's a corner where he was playing outside. I mean, the angle that he was playing at all year was different.
Yeah.
It was just a whole lot different. So that was kind of a negative. And the fact that they didn't find a way to get Houston Griffin more opportunities. I mean, Houston was a little up and down when he played, but you got to give that kid some chances to play and see what he's got. And now you didn't, and now he's out of there.
Now he's leaving.
Really in a big pickle for next year.
We'll cover that later on, but that's tough.
Yeah, but the pass defense as a whole, Vince, was where you saw the big drop off this year. And when you look at the two previous years, they ranked second and third in yards allowed per pass attempt. This year they ranked 47th. That was the one area we saw Notre Dame take a huge step back. Teams were able to make big plays on them.
Yeah.
The pass rush protected them for much of the year. So teams couldn't do it a lot. Because they couldn't protect the quarterback long enough. But the teams that could give any kind of protection to the quarterback were able to expose Notre Dame down the field and were able to beat them for a lot of plays. And it was McLeod at times. It was Sean Crawford at times. It was Clarence Lewis at times. It was Tariq Bracy at times. And late in the year, it was Sean Crawford more often than not. But those were the things where you looked at and say, they're going to have to figure out some answers next year. There's going to have to be open competitions at every defensive back spot except really one, and that's
Kyle Hamilton. Yeah, that's right.
Right. So those are and that's going to be a really interesting part of this offseason, Vince, as we transition. I actually I think the defensive line is still going to be really good. They got to find an answer for strong side end. I predict they'll move Myron Tungavaloa out there at times. I think Justin Ademilola is proving he can be a rotation guy. I think if Isaiah Foskey and Jordan Patelho make the kind of strides as players that I think they're capable of, that's going to be a loaded position next year. They just got to make sure they stay healthy, because after that, there's nothing. With Ovie Agofu leaving, there's nothing. I think defensive tackle is going to be strong. They get everybody back.
You're getting your starters back for sure.
You're getting everybody back, and Jacob Lacey's going to be healthy next year. You get Aiden Keanaaina is going to be a year older. Gabriel Rubio shows up in the spring. So they're going to be loaded inside next year. Linebacker, plenty of bodies inside. Big question mark at Rover. If you don't take one of those Bucks or some Jack Kaiser or Maris and make one of them a Rover to battle with Paul Moala and Isaiah Pryor, I mean, assuming they're running the same kind of defense, I don't know what you're doing here. So, and then, of course, the major question mark is safety. That's the one position on defense that I'm looking in the transfer portal big time, trying to find a guy at safety because with Houston Griffith gone, that is a major question mark. Now, they got some freshmen coming in that I think can help. But I don't want to count
on freshmen to be your starter.
Litchfield Agevon, what kind of growth does he show? Can KJ Wallace kind of step into that Sean Crawford role and be, I think a little better cover player? There's some guys there, but I am absolutely looking into the transfer portal for the right kind of guy. I mean, he's got to be a guy that can come in and start and be a Notre Dame caliber player, but I've got my eyes open. And I think playing beside Kyle Hamilton should probably be an attractive thing for a lot of players. They got to find who the defensive coordinator is first.
Right.
And I'm a little concerned about that right now. Some of the names I'm seeing thrown around as likely options has got me very, very nervous and confused as to why more top defensive coordinators either A, aren't being pursued, or B, aren't interested, which is concerning when you consider the last two defensive coordinators in Notre Dame, one got a huge pay raise at Texas A&M in 1 year, and the other one just got a head coach at an SEC job, So you'd think it'd be a really attractive job, and maybe it will be. Maybe they get Marcus Freeman. The latest I've heard is that there's not a ton of optimism in that. They're still trying, but, I mean, some of the names I'm seeing thrown around,
at least they're trying.
It's the best Notre Dame can do is that.
Yeah.
So it's
it'd be interesting.
A little concerning. But, but again, that's just what we're hearing. We'll see what happens. Brian Kelly's done 3 of his 4 defensive coordinator hires have been very good. So I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, and for now that he's going to do it. But I'm a little bit more nervous now than I was a week ago.
I get it. So on paper, I believe Notre Dame has to replace 5 starters on the defensive side of the ball. But and we're going to go into later on down the road. We're going to go position by position and what we think is going to happen with each group, what we'd like to see happen, et cetera. So be on the lookout for those podcasts because they will be coming. And you'll also have stuff over on irishbreakdown.com, all those position breakdowns, et cetera.
I've already done the 2 defensive end ones. Had the drop end one today, had the strong side end one the other day. So
there you go.
Check those out for sure.
So, and we will have our offensive season breakdown tomorrow, so make sure you stay tuned for that. But that has been our defensive breakdown for the season. We're also going to give out some end-of-the-season awards, Brian.
I'm
personally looking forward to that one. Those are always
that's a fun show because that's pure positive right there. I mean,
that's where we can differ. For all those people that don't want us to get along, there's a chance that we might actually disagree. So that would be
There's
good.
A strong chance. I know in a couple spots that we're going to definitely disagree. But,
So, but we appreciate you joining. We appreciate you listening. We appreciate you downloading. Make sure you head over to irishbreakdown.com, see everything that we've got over there. But until next time, I'm Vince DeDario. This way. That way.
No, you were right the first time.
I was right the first time. I see it's not that way on my screen. All right. Well, either way, that way is Bryan Driskell. And
the guy beside me.
That's right. We'll talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.